How medieval people slept. The strange rituals of nightfall. Hey there, and welcome. Tonight, we begin with something deeply familiar and yet completely bizarre. Sleep. Or more precisely, how medieval people slept, which it turns out is much weirder than anything TikTok or modern sleep coaches could come up with. So before you drift off, just take a moment, not to sit up or do anything grand, just to notice the warmth of your blanket, the hum in the background, and the safe little corner of the world you've carved out to rest in tonight. And if you feel like it, gently tap the like button or subscribe for more sleepy tales. No pressure at all. You're already doing the most important thing, winding down. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn your screen to black, and let's slip softly into another world, one lit by candlelight, wrapped in wool, and utterly unfamiliar. Long before the modern world insisted on 8 straight hours of uninterrupted rest, long before melatonin gummies and white noise apps, people in medieval Europe followed a sleep schedule that would puzzle even the most dedicated night owl. It was called segmented sleep, a natural 2-part rhythm that split the night in half, like a loaf of dark rye broken over dinner. The idea was simple. As the sun went down and the last glow of firelight flickered across stone walls and timber beams, people would crawl into their makeshift beds, not to sleep through the night, but to begin the first half of it. This was known as the first sleep. They'd doze for about 4 hours. Nothing too deep, nothing too shallow, just enough to let the body rest and the mind begin to wander into dreams. But then, and here's the strange part, they'd wake up. Not by accident, on purpose. This middle-of-the-night waking period was so common it had a name, the watch. It lasted about an hour or two, and during this time, people weren't tossing and turning with anxiety or checking their phones for emails. No, they used this quiet stretch of time with surprising calm and intention. They'd pray, sit in silence, stoke the hearth to keep warm. Some would check on their animals, because nothing disrupts a medieval dream like wondering if your one cow has wandered off into the darkness. Others used this time for journaling, or what passed for it, reading holy texts, contemplating dreams, or even chatting softly with family members nearby. And yes, this was also, curiously, the recommended time for intimacy. Medieval physicians and marriage guides noted that the body was relaxed and the mind at peace during the watch, a poetic way of saying, everyone's too sleepy to argue. After this restful intermission, people would drift back into what they called second sleep, which lasted until sunrise, a soft landing back into slumber before roosters or bells stirred the village awake again. This wasn't a quirk of one region or class. It was widespread. Monks, farmers, and even the nobility followed this rhythm. Chaucer and other medieval writers referenced it casually, the way we might mention brushing our teeth. It wasn't special, it was just how sleep worked. And strangely, modern research now tells us this 2-part sleep pattern might actually be closer to what our bodies want. Without artificial light, our natural circadian rhythms tend to divide the night into 2 phases. It's not insomnia, it's biology. So, if you ever wake up in the middle of the night, not stressed, just awake, you're not broken, you're not restless, you're medieval. Just smile, shift in bed, and whisper to yourself, the watch has begun. In those quiet hours, medieval people weren't rushing to fall back asleep. They lived in the pause, in the stillness. No urgency, no guilt, just time. And eventually, they returned to bed, slipping into second sleep like the tide returning to shore. But what were they sleeping on? Well, that's where things get less romantic, because the medieval version of a bed was something between a nest, a haystack, and a shared family pile. But that's a cozy nightmare for the next part. So stay right where you are, warm, relaxed, and drifting gently, as we explore the crinkly, scratchy, communal world of medieval bedding. of nightcaps, ins, and spiritual antivirus before bed. Let's linger a little longer in that chilly stone room. We've covered how they slept and what they slept on, but now let's talk about what they wore to bed. Today, when you hear nightcap, you might imagine a cozy little drink, maybe warm milk, maybe something with whiskey, the kind of thing you sip before curling up with a soft blanket and a bad decision. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap was no drink. It was a hat, a real, physical, and often hilariously pointy hat. Its purpose? To keep your head from freezing off while you slept. You see, medieval buildings weren't exactly known for insulation. Most homes had stone walls, open hearths, and roofs that whistled with every passing breeze. Windows, if you even had one, might be made of oiled parchment or thin animal horn. That meant no glass and no mercy from the cold. So the nightcap was born, not for style, but for survival. These caps came in all shapes and sizes. The most iconic style looked like something a wizard might wear to bed, long, droopy, and utterly undignified. Men wore them, women wore them, children wore them. Even a goat, if it stood still long enough, might have gotten one. For women, the nightcap sometimes doubled as a coif or head wrap, both a warming layer and a form of modesty. In fact, in many regions, married women were expected to keep their heads covered at all times, yes, even while asleep. Hair, after all, was a scandalous business, especially if it hadn't been washed since, well, last Lent. But these caps weren't just practical, they were symbolic. In urban areas, wearing your nightcap around the house was like putting up a polite "do not disturb" sign. If someone knocked on your door and you answered in your cap, the message was clear. This hat means go away. I'm off duty. Please come back when I've had breakfast and fewer fleas. Paired with the classic nightshirt, a long, loose tunic made of scratchy linen, medieval sleepwear wasn't sexy, stylish, or particularly soft, but it was functional, mostly. Also itchy and occasionally flammable, which added a nice thrill to bedtime near an open hearth. But what if you didn't have a bed? What if you were traveling? Let's say you're a merchant, a pilgrim, or just someone whose mule gave up halfway to Norwich. You wander into a village, knock on the door of the local inn, and ask for a place to sleep. Sounds simple, but what you get is not. Medieval inns were nothing like today's cozy bed and breakfasts. You didn't get a private room. You didn't get a clean mattress. You didn't even get a guarantee of sleeping alone. What you got was a spot, in a bed, already occupied. That's right, sharing a bed with total strangers was not just common, it was standard practice. Inns were more like bunkhouses than hotels, and if there was space in a bed, you were climbing in. 2 people, 3 people, 4 if the innkeeper was particularly optimistic, all snoring, sweating, shifting, and silently judging each other's hygiene. And this wasn't considered rude. It was efficient. Beds were precious. Privacy was a luxury. If the bed had room, you sprawled, preferably before someone else beat you to it. Some inns tried to be organized. They'd sort guests by profession, blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, thieves with other thieves, allegedly. But mostly it was first come, first horizontal. Worried about theft? Of course you were. Most travelers slept with their coin purses tied to their belts or tucked under their tunics. Others turned their baggage into a pillow, using it as both headrest and primitive alarm system. If your sack of apples moved in the night, chances are you were about to wake up appleless. As for the rich, they traveled with entourages, tents, guards, and enough bedding to qualify as a mobile castle. They'd rent out entire rooms or bribe the innkeeper for some peace and personal space. Because if you're going to judge someone snoring, it might as well be your own squire. But bedtime bedtime wasn't just cold and crowded, it was also, in its own way, terrifying. Because in the medieval world, going to bed meant you might not wake up. So before sleep came a ritual, a spiritual checklist, a final report to the divine before you vanished into dreams, or worse, something permanent. Bedtime prayers weren't just comforting, they were damage control. The chapel, lit only by flickering flames and a divine sense of sleep deprivation, the monks would begin matins, a long, slow chant of psalms, hymns, and readings that somehow managed to be both reverent and slightly hypnotic. If Gregorian chanting ever felt like a lullaby hummed by a particularly pious ghost, this was it. There was no clapping, no talking, and absolutely no yawning, though, of course, everyone was yawning internally. They stood or knelt in rows, their breath misting in the cold air, reciting scripture with eyes that had barely opened. And no, there was no coffee. The monks fueled themselves purely on divine purpose, muscle memory, and whatever spiritual caffeine came from the Latin phrase, Domine labia mea aperis, O Lord, open my lips. Some monks, perhaps the more mischievous or merely exhausted ones, would sway slightly during the prayers, not from rapture, but from sleepiness. There are stories of novices nodding off mid-chant only to be roused by a gentle nudge or a less gentle smack with a wooden psalter. You didn't want to be the one who face-planted into the candle stand. Matins could last anywhere from an hour to 2, depending on the feast day, the abbey's tradition, and how long the abbot felt like keeping everyone awake. After that, the monks might return to their wooden beds or stay up for the next canonical hour, lauds, because who needs REM sleep when your soul is on a schedule? But all of this wasn't considered burdensome. No, this nightly routine was viewed as purifying, a spiritual discipline that tested the body and lifted the soul. And while it sounds like a nightmare for the average insomniac, for monks it was as normal as cold soup and celibacy. Meanwhile, outside the cloistered stone walls, the rest of medieval society was engaged in their own midnight rituals, some less holy, some more heated, and some just plain weird. Let's drift now into the stranger side of medieval nighttime, where sleep wasn't just a biological necessity, but also a social opportunity, a spiritual event, and sometimes a health treatment. Because, believe it or not, medieval people had opinions about how you should sleep. Yes, medical theories, based more on ancient Greek humors than actual anatomy, offered advice on sleeping positions. Physicians recommended sleeping on your right side first to help with digestion, then switching to your left to stimulate the heart. Sleeping on your back was discouraged unless you wanted to invite nightmares, demonic visitations, or, worst of all, snoring so loud it disturbed the entire goat population. Sleeping on your stomach? Absolutely not. That was considered dangerous to your soul and suspicious to your reputation. A sleeping position could be read like a confession. Upright and tight-lipped? Holy. Splayed out and snoring? Definitely a sinner. They even believed in seasonal sleeping techniques. In the winter, you were encouraged to sleep more to preserve heat, and in summer, to sleep less, lest your natural moisture evaporate. Sleep, like everything else, was a question of balance. Too much, and you risked sloth, a deadly sin. Too little, and you might hallucinate demons, which, ironically, could also lead you to sin. But perhaps the most baffling belief was that bad dreams could be caused by indigestion, and that eating certain foods before bed might invite devilish visions. Cabbage, for instance, was fine, but cheese? Cheese was suspicious. Too much of it, and you might find yourself battling dragons in your dreams, or worse, arguing with your dead grandmother. So medieval people managed their pre-bed routines accordingly. Light meals, cold feet, whispered prayers, a quick check under the bed for demons, and then, ideally, sleep. But just as you think things are finally winding down, there's one more surprise lurking in the shadows, one more piece of bedtime strangeness we haven't explored yet. Because while peasants lay under damp straw, nobles under feathered luxury, and monks on wooden planks, there were night watchers who didn't sleep at all. But we'll save that for the next part of our journey. Medieval beds were pest paradises. Forget thread counts or memory foam. What you really needed was a solid tolerance for itching. Bedbugs weren't a rare nuisance, they were expected guests. Lice, fleas, and even the occasional mouse treated your straw mattress like a timeshare. No one was immune. Peasants scratched, nobles scratched more quietly, possibly while blaming the servants, and monks, well, they considered itching just another form of penance. Bedding hygiene was creative. Mattresses were typically sacks filled with straw, rushes, or feathers if you were rich, although those feathers were rarely washed and often full of little surprises. Blankets were heavy, rarely laundered, and shared with everyone, siblings, cousins, and vermin alike. Changing the bedding? That might happen once a season. Maybe twice if the plague didn't hit. Instead, you might air your mattress, meaning you dragged it outside, smacked it with a stick, and prayed the sun would chase out the bugs and the sin. To cope with the relentless itching, people used powders made of herbs, ashes, or even dried animal dung, believing it would ward off pests. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it just gave the bugs seasoning. Noble women occasionally shaved their heads to discourage lice, then wore elaborate headdresses that promptly invited them back in. It was a cycle, a very itchy, very undignified cycle. And yet, despite all this, the medieval world just slept on. It was noisy, crowded, itchy, smoky, drafty, uncomfortable, and spiritually alarming. But it was also routine, familiar, human. And once you settled into the rhythm, once you'd fluffed your flea-filled pillow, curled up beside your cousin, said a quick prayer against demonic invasion, and adjusted your sitting-up sleeping angle, it might have even felt safe. Because in a world full of danger, disease, and darkness, a warm, shared bed, even one with bugs and snoring livestock, meant you were alive. Tired, itchy, cold, but alive. Now, as we prepare to drift off from this medieval midnight, imagine the comfort of your clean sheets, your soft pillow, and your private bed. No pigs at your feet, no bell at 2 a.m., no Brother Ambrose singing off-key beside you. Just silence, just rest, just sleep. And perhaps, if you're lucky, a dream or two. Let's just hope they aren't planted by demons. Good night, time traveler. May your dreams be peaceful, your mattress pest-free, and your spiritual armor slightly more comfortable. Sleepwalking and the nighttime specters. In our modern world, sleepwalking is often met with mild concern or a funny story. A child wandering into the kitchen at 2 a.m. looking for cookies, or a groggy adult trying to open a closet they think is the bathroom. But in the Middle Ages, if you started walking around at night with glazed eyes and no memory of it later, you were more likely to be treated like a walking omen than a sleepy housemate. Let's set the scene. A small, creaking cottage in a fog-drenched village. The only light comes from the fading glow of a peat fire and the flicker of a tallow candle. Somewhere in the corner, a child stirs. They rise slowly, their eyes open but unfocused, lips mumbling something between a prayer and gibberish, stepping softly over a snoring pig. The family wakes, sees the figure shuffling silently toward the door, and panics. The devil, they whisper, or worse, a soul untethered from its body. Because in the Middle Ages, sleepwalking, or as they sometimes called it, noctambulation, wasn't just misunderstood, it was feared, wildly feared. People believed that when someone walked in their sleep, it wasn't just a bodily glitch or too much barley stew. It was a symptom of something deeply wrong. either a spiritual disturbance, an evil enchantment, or a soul being temporarily hijacked by forces unknown. Some believed that the soul left the body during sleep to wander, learn, or confess in dreams. But if the soul took too long on its spiritual errands, the body might begin to move on its own, guided either by muscle memory or, more disturbingly, by dark influences. A sleepwalker wasn't just a person asleep, they were a hollow shell, vulnerable to demonic possession or otherworldly manipulation. It didn't help that sleepwalkers often looked eerily like ghosts, pale, silent, eyes wide and staring, speaking languages they didn't know, Latin, Greek, or worse, sometimes reciting snippets of scripture or curse-like phrases. To a superstitious villager who just sat through a sermon about the dangers of moral laxity, this wasn't a sleep disorder. This was a spiritual crisis, or the beginning of an exorcism. And let's not forget the hazards. Medieval homes were not exactly childproof. Open flames, knives left out from dinner, stone staircases with no railings, the ever-present chamber pot, and in rural areas, animals slept indoors, which meant stepping on a sleeping goose could turn a harmless nighttime stroll into a chaotic honking disaster. To prevent nocturnal wandering, people tried everything. Herbal remedies like valerian root or poppy tea, though that could lead to deeper, more unsettling dreams. Religious households sprinkled holy water around the bed. Some hung iron charms above the sleeping person, believing iron repelled spirits. In truly concerned families, or just the very practical ones, the solution was simpler. They tied the sleepwalker's leg to a post or their wrist to the bed frame. Not cruel, just very, very preventative. In monasteries, sleepwalking was treated more quietly but no less seriously. A monk caught walking the halls at night might be interrogated, gently of course, about temptations, sins, or strange thoughts. If the abbot suspected demonic influence, prayers would be ordered. If it happened again, stricter measures followed. Fasting, confession, more sleep, ironically, or, in extreme cases, a public act of penance. Among the noble class, the reactions varied. Some saw it as a sign of divine visions, especially if the sleepwalker said anything poetic or mysterious. Others saw it as madness or weakness. A sleepwalking noblewoman might be kept under tighter watch. A sleepwalking knight, perhaps haunted by battlefield memories. Or, less romantically, maybe he just drank too much spiced wine. There were even stories, half truth, half legend, of sleepwalkers climbing rooftops, scaling towers, or walking barefoot into the woods. If they returned unscathed, it was a miracle. If they didn't, well, the tales often ended with moral lessons about sin, night spirits, and the importance of sharing a bed so someone could grab your ankle when you wandered. So next time you wake up groggy and find your socks in the fridge, just be glad you're not in 13th century France, where that might have earned you a visit from the village priest, a bucket of holy water, and a new nickname, Devil Walker. Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Paris's household, was the most dramatic target of all. She was of indigenous or African descent, sources vary, and in the eyes of Puritan Salem, her very presence already carried the weight of otherness. She told stories of voodoo and spirits to the girls, possibly as folklore or entertainment, but in a community where even a dancing shadow could be demonic, such tales weren't exotic, they were dangerous. When accused, Tituba initially denied the charges, but under intense pressure and likely coercion, she confessed. Her admission opened the floodgates. She claimed there were witches in the village and that she had seen the devil himself. Her confession wasn't just a survival tactic, it became a catalyst. If one witch confessed, surely there were others hiding among the wheat and prayer books. And suddenly, Salem turned in on itself. Neighbors began accusing each other. old grudges resurfaced under the mask of piety. A cow that died mysteriously? Surely the work of a witch. A child born sickly? Witchcraft. A butter churn that wouldn't churn? You guessed it, witch. In this world of cold nights, long prayers, and creeping superstition, the village's fears began to blur the line between the spiritual and the absurd. In this spiraling atmosphere, the afflicted girls became both celebrities and judges. People watched as they collapsed in fits and claimed invisible torments. Their voices carried weight in courtrooms filled with weeping families and stern magistrates. Grown men hung on their every word. This strange elevation of adolescent girls to instruments of divine justice was unprecedented and terrifying. As trials began in earnest, something even more disturbing crept into the process: spectral evidence. If a person claimed they saw your spirit in a dream or being tormented by your ghostly form, it was considered valid proof in court. Not what you did, but what someone claimed your spirit did was enough to see you hanged. Reality bent under the weight of belief. By the time the hysteria reached its peak, even pillars of the community were accused. Martha Corey, a devout churchgoer, found herself named. When she laughed at the accusations and suggested the girls were lying, she was arrested. Surely only a witch would mock a court. Even Rebecca Nurse, elderly and beloved, was imprisoned and later hanged. It wasn't just Salem Village anymore, it had spread. People from Andover, Ipswich, and other towns were pulled into the widening net. The jails filled with the old, the young, the innocent. Families were torn apart. Some confessed falsely, hoping to escape execution. Others refused to lie and paid the ultimate price. And while this horror unfolded by day, at night, people still had to sleep, somehow. Imagine lying on a straw mattress, your breath forming clouds in the winter air, knowing that tomorrow might bring your name before the judges. You'd huddle under your cloak, whispering prayers, not just for deliverance, but that the devil wouldn't visit in your dreams, because someone might claim he did. It's easy, from the comfort of a modern bed, to see it all as madness, but to them, it was terrifyingly real. Devils in the dark, witches in the barn, children who could see the unseen. In a world where illness struck without warning, crops failed for no reason, and every shadow flickered with uncertainty, witchcraft offered an explanation, a cruel one. By the end of the trials, over 200 people had been accused. 30 were found guilty. 19 were executed by hanging. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. And then, almost as quickly as it began, it stopped. Doubt crept in. Prominent figures began to question the use of spectral evidence. The governor, whose own wife had been named, dissolved the special court. The afflicted girls began to fall silent. And in the bitter aftermath, Salem was left with nothing but graves and guilt. Tituba survived. Sold to pay her jail fees, her fate remains largely unknown. Sarah Good cursed her judges as she stood at the gallows. Rebecca Nurse was buried in secret by her family. Her name eventually cleared, though far too late. Centuries later, the Salem witch trials remain a haunting reminder of what fear can do. A warning carved into the pages of history, not just about superstition, but about sleep-deprived societies, insular communities, and the terrible things people believe in the dark. And so tonight, if you find yourself lying in bed, people whose only crime was being noticed at the wrong time, or not noticed enough. Maybe they argued with a neighbor, failed to show proper piety, or simply didn't look frightened enough in church. In a world where suspicion was currency, even your silence could be damning. And all the while, life continued. Cows still needed milking, fields had to be plowed, children had to be fed. In the cold corners of their homes, families whispered prayers by candlelight, wondering who might vanish next. Mothers held their daughters tighter, fathers checked their doors twice. And somewhere in the woods, the quiet creak of the gallows rope became part of the wind. The jails, if they could be called that, were more like tombs. Cold, damp, infested with rats and fleas. Food was scarce, and prisoners often relied on family members to bring scraps from home. Some shackled their own limbs to prevent accusations of witchcraft in the night. Others began to pray out loud, constantly, as if God might overhear them and intervene before the court did. And in those dark places, another kind of sickness took root: doubt. Some judges began to worry. Had they gone too far? Were these trials really rooted in truth or terror? Even Reverend Increase Mather, a powerful Puritan minister, began to question the use of spectral evidence. In a powerful sermon, he warned, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned." His words were not just theological, they were political. The colony's governor, William Phips, took notice. By October 1692, the tide turned. The court of Oyer and Terminer was disbanded. A new, more cautious court was formed. Spectral evidence was no longer allowed. Dozens of prisoners were released. The executions stopped. But the damage was done. 19 hanged, 1 crushed, 5 died in jail, over 200 accused, entire families shattered, children orphaned, communities fractured, and the cold truth: no witches were ever found because there had never been any to begin with. In the months and years that followed, Salem tried to forget, but forgetting wasn't easy. Some judges publicly repented. Jurors expressed regret. The colony eventually granted compensation to the victims' families, though not nearly enough to rebuild what had been lost. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, stood before his congregation in 1697, dressed in sackcloth, and read a public confession of guilt. He begged God's forgiveness. Few others followed suit. But the ghosts of Salem were not so easily exorcised. The village lived on, but quieter, more cautious. Gossip was whispered a little softer. Accusations were measured more carefully. For generations, Salem became a symbol, not of evil, but of fear, not of witches, but of what people will do when they're scared, tired, and desperate for someone to blame. And still, sleep came. Somehow, that winter, families gathered around hearths and tried to return to normal life. They mended clothes by candlelight. They told stories in low voices. Some still whispered about dreams and devils. Others refused to speak at all about what had happened. A few claimed they could still hear the creak of Gallows Hill in the wind. But slowly, like frost melting from the fields, the village thawed. The seasons turned, and history, as it always does, began to bury the past under layers of newer worries. Yet, the story remains. It's in the grain of the old wooden beams in Salem's houses, in the moss-covered stones of forgotten graves, in the quiet realization that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the dark is not a witch, but a frightened neighbor holding a torch. So tonight, if you find yourself lying in bed, somewhere warm and safe, think of those who once tried to sleep while the world spun madly around them, who dreamt not of witches, but of survival, who prayed not for riches, but for morning, who learned, too late, that the scariest dreams are the ones that happen with your eyes wide open. And if you listen very closely, you might just hear the echo of footsteps on snow, the distant toll of a church bell, and the voice of someone in the next room whispering your name. But don't worry, it's just a story. Sleep tight. Returned home to find their land seized, their reputations ruined, and their families broken beyond repair. Salem was not a village of victors or villains. It was a community left to sift through the ashes of its own collapse. And what does one do with silence that follows a storm? Some tried to forget, but forgetting wasn't so easy when the very pews where you knelt in prayer had once hosted whispered accusations. when the gallows had cast their shadow across your own doorstep, when your neighbor had cheered your mother's hanging, or worse, stayed quiet while it happened. Others tried to heal. Memorials were modest and often private, crosses carved into door frames, initials etched into stones behind homes. In the years that followed, the colony offered token compensations to the families of the executed, but no coin could repay the price of fear. No land could restore a name whispered in shame. In 1706, years after the trials had ended, Ann Putnam Jr., one of the chief accusers and the daughter of a prominent family, stood before her church and delivered a public confession. She admitted that her accusations were false, that she had been deluded by Satan. She begged forgiveness from the families she had helped destroy. It was the first and only formal apology from an accuser. By then, the village of Salem had already begun to fracture. Salem Village and Salem Town, once parts of the same community, would eventually split into different places, different names, different paths. Perhaps this was fitting. After all, the village had torn itself in two long before the map cut up. In 1711, the Massachusetts legislature passed a bill to clear the names of many of the accused and offer modest reparations to surviving family members. But not all names were cleared. Some, like Bridget Bishop and Giles Corey, remained tainted for decades. It would take over 300 years until 2001 for the state to officially declare every last accused innocent. But even absolution cannot rewind time. And so, the story of Salem was never truly buried. It settled instead like a layer of fine dust over bookshelves, courthouse steps, and old Bibles. It lived in cautionary tales, in schoolrooms and sermons, in theater and literature. Arthur Miller's The Crucible would one day hold a mirror to another era of suspicion, and in that mirror, Salem's pale face would blink back at America again. Today, the town remembers in hushed tones and candlelight vigils. In the cobbled streets and crooked fences, you can still feel it, the chill of what happens when fear overrides reason, when justice loses its footing, and when ordinary people, through silence or shouts, become part of something far greater and far darker than themselves. Because in the end, the Salem witch trials were never really about witches. They were about us, our fear, our hunger for control, our quickness to judge, our failure to listen, the ways we convince ourselves we are righteous even as we tighten the noose. So tonight, as the world quiets down, as the wind nudges gently at your window, remember the whispered names: Rebecca, Giles, Mary, Dorothy. Remember the moments when a village forgot its own heart. And sleep, perhaps, a little more softly, knowing how thin the veil between order and chaos truly is. You are safe now, but only because we remember. The Salem witch trials didn't just end with the last drop of blood spilled on Gallows Hill. No, the true torment began afterward, in the silence left behind, in the shattered lives, and in a village struggling to breathe again beneath the heavy weight of guilt. Imagine losing your home, your health, and nearly your life, only to be handed a bill for the privilege of surviving. Families, already broken by grief, found themselves paying fees for jail time endured by their loved ones. By the time the nightmare ended, 19 souls had been hanged, 1 pressed to death under unbearable stones, 5 more perished in the foul confines of overcrowded jails, and over 200 people, neighbors, friends, parents, and children, were accused. But the court didn't just collapse, it imploded, leaving behind a crater of guilt, grief, and disbelief. Salem was forever changed. The gallows were silent, the jails emptied, yet peace remained elusive. No ghosts haunted the town, only memories heavy with sorrow. What had begun with a handful of frightened girls spiraled into a communal act of destruction, ripping apart families, tearing at the fabric of community itself. Neighbors who once prayed side by side now refused to meet each other's gaze. The very people who had testified against the accused carried the unbearable weight of their decisions that destroyed lives. Some of the afflicted girls quietly slipped away from Salem, shadows of their former selves. A few, like Ann Putnam Jr., would, years later, stand before their congregations and publicly apologize, blaming their actions on delusion and the devil's influence. But for most, the damage was too deep, too raw. The court officials bore their own burdens. Judge Samuel Sewell, one of the few who admitted guilt, performed a remarkable act of public penance in 1697. Standing before his congregation, he asked for forgiveness, a rare moment of accountability in an era that preferred forgetting. Yet forgetting was impossible. Families demanded justice, their petitions flooding the Massachusetts government, asking for pardons, the restoration of property, and public acknowledgement of the innocent lives lost. Slowly, the colony responded. In 1711, a bill was passed restoring the good names and rights of some victims and offering limited compensation to their heirs. But not all were remembered. Families like the Coreys and Proctors were left out of these restitutions, their scars ignored. Whispers of witchcraft never fully disappeared from New England, but Salem's shame became part of its identity. The town eventually changed its name to Danvers, as if renaming could erase a past stained with blood. Gallows Hill remained unmarked, as though burying the memory was easier than confronting it. Yet the memory persisted, in sermons, in stories passed down, and in the silences between former friends. Salem was not cursed by witches. No, it was cursed by fear, by pride, by unchecked power. And that curse lingered long after the last execution. The Salem witch trials ended more than 3 centuries ago, but their echoes remain. They teach us about the fragility of truth and justice, how easily logic can crumble when fear takes control. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, ministers, became executioners simply by believing too easily and questioning too little. The courts, meant to protect the innocent, became tools of oppression. Religion was weaponized. Testimony became theater. Silence became guilt. One of the most chilling truths of Salem is how quickly it all happened. In just months, fear overwhelmed fact. Old grudges, disguised as spiritual warfare, became death sentences. It did not take demons or devils to destroy Salem, only belief in them. But from this darkness came lessons hard learned. The Salem episode would shape American ideals of justice. The U.S. Constitution, written nearly a century later, explicitly guaranteed the rights that had been trampled in Salem. The right to legal counsel, the right to face one's accusers, the demand for real, concrete evidence. The phrase witch hunt has entered our language, often tossed about lightly. But in Salem, it wasn't a metaphor. It was a real nightmare. A town where people were hanged for crimes that never existed, betrayed by systems meant to protect them. Politics in ancient Rome was never confined to the Senate or the Forum. It was played out in whispered rumors, secret backroom deals, marriages, and even funerals. Women in elite Roman households were expected to be quiet partners, refined, educated, obedient. They were to listen more than speak, to support rather than lead. But Fulvia was different. Born into the wealthy and ambitious Fulvi family, she was highly educated and politically connected. From a young age, Fulvia showed she was no timid spectator. She was sharp, fearless, and ready to seize the reins. Her early life remains somewhat a mystery. But the actions of her later years reveal a woman who watched closely, understood the shifting tides of power, and acted with boldness few Roman women dared. This wasn't the modest matron Rome idealized. Fulvia saw politics not as a man's arena to fear, but as a battlefield to master. She came of age during one of the most turbulent eras in Roman history, a time when the Republic was unraveling. Civil wars, populist revolts, and rivalries between generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Julius Caesar turned Rome into a pressure cooker of ambition and violence. The old rules were collapsing, and Fulvia was ready. Her life would defy expectations. She married 3 powerful men, each a radical force in Roman politics. But she didn't just marry power, she commanded it. Fulvia led armies, fueled revolts, and became the first Roman woman to appear on coinage, not as a goddess, but as herself. Rome wasn't ready for Fulvia, but she was ready for Rome. Her first marriage was to Publius Clodius Pulcher, a populist agitator known for stirring chaos. Clodius was no ordinary nobleman. To the elite, he was a dangerous political firebrand. To the masses, he was a hero. And to Fulvia, he was an opportunity. Their marriage in the early 50s BCE united Fulvia with a man who had turned Roman politics into spectacle. Clodius was infamous for flouting tradition. Once, he even disguised himself as a woman to infiltrate a secret female religious ceremony, a scandalous act that only boosted his popularity. He renounced his patrician status to run for tribune of the plebs, a powerful office with veto rights over the Senate. He understood Rome's street politics better than most. And Fulvia was no silent wife. Roman accounts show she was deeply involved, managing supporters, hosting political gatherings, and standing visibly by his side during campaigns. Together, they formed a bold new kind of power couple, unapologetically populist and aggressive. But their alliance came at a cost. In 52 BCE, Clodius was brutally murdered on the Appian Way by bodyguards of his rival, Titus Annius Milo. His death shocked Rome, yet Fulvia refused to mourn quietly. She staged a political funeral that historians still remember. She paraded Clodius's mutilated body through the forum, wounds exposed, bloodied and raw, making a public spectacle that enraged citizens. Riots erupted. The Senate House was burned down. Fulvia had transformed her grief into an act of political warfare. Her ability to manipulate public emotion and wield spectacle as strategy marked her as a formidable force. Clodius was dead, but Fulvia had stepped into the light, and Rome could never ignore her again. She didn't linger in mourning. Political capital in Rome was fleeting, and she knew it well. Soon she married again, this time to Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising political star and fervent supporter of Julius Caesar. Curio was flamboyant and dramatic, but beneath the surface, he was a sharp strategist. As tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, he wielded significant influence during a fragile time as Rome teetered between war and uneasy peace. Fulvia saw in Curio not just a husband, but a new political anchor. She needed someone to carry forward the populist legacy left by Clodius and someone with Caesar's backing. Curio set the bill. Through him, Fulvia remained deeply embedded in Rome's shifting power dynamics. She didn't just marry into the movement, she helped shape it. She ensured Clodius's supporters stayed active, rebranding their cause under Curio's leadership and keeping Rome's urban masses engaged. But the Republic was collapsing faster than anyone imagined. Civil war erupted between Caesar and Pompey. Curio threw himself into the conflict. Rome's civil unrest had claimed 2 of Fulvia's husbands, both martyrs of populist causes. But Fulvia was far from finished. Her most audacious chapter, her most famous partnership, was yet to come. Her third marriage was to Mark Antony, the ambitious general and loyal ally of Julius Caesar. Their union, forged around 47 BCE, was no mere romantic attachment. It was a merger of raw, relentless power. Fulvia had already proven herself a master of Roman street politics. Antony, rapidly rising through military and political ranks, needed exactly that kind of savvy. Together, they became one of the most politically potent couples of the late Republic. By the time they married, Fulvia was no stranger to blood, betrayal, and political carnage. She had buried 2 husbands and outmaneuvered countless enemies. Antony, for all his bravado, was no stranger to scandal either. He drank deeply, gambled wildly, and his personal life was notoriously chaotic. But with Fulvia, he found more than entertainment. He found a partner who could defend his interests, hold his alliances together, and rally supporters when he was away on campaign. And Antony, despite his brash exterior, understood her value. He allowed Fulvia to exercise a kind of authority no Roman woman had wielded before. She opened his correspondence, issued orders in his absence, sat in on political meetings, influenced appointments. Roman sources, mostly hostile and misogynistic, painted her as overbearing and power-hungry. But what truly unsettled them was not her ambition. It was that she acted like a Roman man in a world with no language for such a woman. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, the Republic plunged once more into chaos. Antony rushed to secure his position as Caesar's political heir. But it was Fulvia who held Rome itself. While Antony formed the Second Triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, Fulvia acted as his proxy in the capital. She managed patronage networks, coordinated with street gangs, and ensured Antony's supporters stayed mobilized. She even orchestrated Antony's official reconciliation with Octavian by marrying her daughter Claudia to him, an alliance that would later implode spectacularly. In public, Fulvia appeared not just as Antony's wife, but as his political substitute. Roman coins were minted bearing both Antony's image and her name, an unprecedented acknowledgement of her status. She was not hidden in the shadows. She stood in the full glare of power. But power in Rome was always borrowed, and Fulvia was about to test how far a woman could go before Rome snapped back. While Antony pursued military campaigns and political deals across the Roman world, it was Fulvia who controlled the streets of Rome. She wasn't just his wife, she was his regent in all but name. In a time where violence, bribery, and raw influence kept order, Fulvia proved she could play the game as well as, if not better than, any man in the Senate. Rome, in the aftermath of Caesar's murder, was a battlefield without swords. Power was fluid, a moving target. Fulvia understood this. She anchored Antony's authority in the capital by becoming his political substitute. She directed allies, dealt with the urban plebs, negotiated with factions, and most daringly, waged war with words and silver. She financed loyal troops, offered bribes to keep order, ensured legislation favored Antony's future. Ancient sources, especially hostile ones like Appian and Dio Cassius, paint Fulvia as manipulative, shrewish, even warmongering. But beneath the misogynistic exaggerations lies a truth. A woman actively doing politics in a world with no protocol for a woman beyond weaving and mourning. Fulvia built coalitions, backed military commanders, issued decrees, roles reserved for senators and consuls. She made public appearances, maintained strong ties with veteran soldiers, a vital political force in late Republic struggles. While Antony campaigned in the East, Fulvia was often the face of his authority in Italy, meeting centurions, influencing land distribution, reminding soldiers that loyalty to Antony came with rewards. But this growing power came at a cost. Roman aristocrats, especially those aligned with Octavian, Caesar's heir, and Antony's rival, resented Fulvia's influence. They saw her as a meddling woman with too much sway over legions, laws. The war was triggered by Octavian's controversial land redistribution program, displacing many Italians to reward his soldiers. Fulvia seized on this swelling discontent, portraying Octavian as a tyrant and a traitor to Caesar's legacy. With Lucius Antonius acting as her frontman in the Senate and Fulvia orchestrating behind the scenes, they raised 8 legions and seized the city of Perugia, modern-day Perugia. Make no mistake, this was Fulvia's war. Ancient sources suggest she was more invested in the conflict than Lucius himself. She rallied troops, stirred public opinion, and even corresponded directly with generals. Rome buzzed with rumors of her commanding legions, issuing orders, and forcing Lucius into confrontations he'd rather avoid. Octavian, though caught by surprise, acted swiftly. He besieged Perugia through the bitter winter of 4140 BCE, cutting off supplies and pounding the city into submission. Fulvia, trapped between dwindling food and political betrayal, watched her bold gamble unravel. By early 40 BCE, the city surrendered. Lucius Antonius was spared, likely a gesture to avoid alienating Antony. But Fulvia was exiled. The woman who once commanded riots, marriages, armies, and public opinion was now deemed too dangerous for Roman soil. She was sent to Sicyon in Greece, where she hoped to reunite with Antony. But Antony did not come running. The once powerful alliance between husband and wife had eroded in the fog of war and distance. Fulvia had acted in his name, but perhaps without his blessing. She had dared to do what no Roman woman had before, wage civil war. And now the Republic made her pay. Banished from Rome, Fulvia landed in Sicyon, a city that had become a kind of diplomatic purgatory for failed power players. She had gone to war not for personal gain, but in her husband's name. She believed she was defending Antony's interests, his honor, and perhaps their shared vision of Rome. But what awaited her in exile was silence. Fulvia had risked everything, her status, her alliances, her life. Yet Antony did not immediately come to meet her. By the time Fulvia arrived in Greece, Antony was already entangled with Cleopatra in Egypt. Whether their romantic relationship had begun or was merely brewing, the symbolism was crushing. While Fulvia raised legions, Antony raised goblets beside a queen. The betrayal cut deep, not just personally, but politically. Fulvia had fought a war to protect Antony's power in Italy, and in response, he left her to hang out to dry. Some ancient historians, notably Plutarch, suggest Antony was furious she launched the Perusian War without his direct approval. Others argue he welcomed her downfall. It cleared the way for a marriage alliance with Octavian, something Fulvia would never have tolerated. Still, she wasn't entirely without supporters. Some of Antony's troops, fiercely loyal to her, urged reconciliation. But her health had begun to fail. After enduring siege, exile, and betrayal, Fulvia died in Sicyon in 40 BCE, possibly from illness, stress, heartbreak, or all three. She was around 43 years old. Her death provided Antony with a clean political exit. He soon met with Octavian and agreed to marry Octavia's sister Octavia as part of a new peace treaty. The triumvirs were temporarily united again, but only because Fulvia, the one woman bold enough to challenge their designs, was gone. Fulvia's legacy would soon be overshadowed by Cleopatra, whose myths consumed nearly every Roman woman of the period. But make no mistake, Fulvia was the prototype. She didn't wield power from behind a curtain. She marched into it, stood at the center, and dared to command armies in a world that treated women as furniture. Rome didn't know what to do with her, so it erased her. But the ashes of her rebellion lingered. Her story was far from ordinary. After Fulvia's death, the men she once maneuvered, Antony, Octavian, and even former allies, began quietly rewriting her legacy. She could not defend herself, so the narrative. Bayard Rustin stood at the heart of a movement that demanded change not with violence, but with courage, unwavering, disciplined, and visible to the world. He understood something timeless, that true power is born not from domination, but from the will to change an unjust system. From the ancient streets of Rome, where Fulvia raised legions and commanded armies in a world determined to silence her, to the bustling avenues of 20th century Washington, D.C., where thousands gathered to march for justice and equality, the spirit of defiance echoes across time. Fulvia dared to wield power in a world that said women should be silent. She was erased, slandered, forgotten by history's loudest voices. Yet her legacy endured. Her courage left fingerprints on the collapse of an empire and the birth of a new order. Centuries later, Bayard Rustin and the leaders of the civil rights movement stood on that legacy, knowing that change demanded boldness. They refused to wait for permission. They refused to accept a world built on inequality and fear. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stepped to the microphone on that historic day in August 1963, he gave voice to a dream not unlike the one Fulvia fought for, a dream of dignity, justice, and the right to live free. That dream was a declaration that no system, no matter how old or entrenched, is unbreakable. That power, when wielded by the determined and the just, can bend history's arc toward freedom. Fulvia's war was fought with swords and legions. Hers was a battle against an empire's collapse. The March on Washington was fought with signs and songs, a battle against the lingering shadows of segregation. Different eras, different weapons, but the same unyielding resolve. As the crowds surged forward in Washington, as voices rose in unison demanding change, the world witnessed the power of defiance, a power that can't be silenced, erased, or forgotten. It is a power born in the footsteps of women like Fulvia and carried forward by every soul who dares to stand and say, "Enough." So this is more than a story of ancient Rome or 1960s America. It is a testament, a reminder that history remembers those who refuse to be silenced, and that the fight for justice, for power, for dignity, it is a story without end. Narrator softly with hope. Because in every age, when the world says stay in your place, there will always be those who rise. And their legacy, it is the spark that lights the way for all who come after.